Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome. I'm Bill Brown of Brookings Mountain West. So on behalf of my Brookings Mountain West and UNLV colleagues, a special thanks for coming out tonight under some unusual circumstances. I don't know if you noticed our banners blowing off the student union as you came in. That's something not expected. But what I can tell you to expect tonight is a great talk from a Brookings colleague, Gary Burtless, who's here. This is Gary's first visit to UNLV as a Brookings scholar, not his first visit to Las Vegas. And he's going to talk tonight on another key topic for our region, our city, our state, and our region, jobs. And as we now see signs of recovery, both locally and across the nation, people are asking that very question: where are the jobs? And Gary is uniquely qualified to give us some insights. He's a senior fellow in economic studies at Brookings and has written and published extensively on jobs, unemployment, the labor market. I will take just a second for a couple commercials. Our next lecture will be on March 20th. Hope you can join us for. Peter Singer will be back. Those of you who may have heard Peter speak here before, he's an expert on US military policy and technology, and is a gifted speaker as well, and hope you'll be able to join us for that. On another note, I'm happy to have in my hands a publication of Brookings Mountain West that will be formally released on Monday. It's called America's New Swing Region. It's a series of papers at a conference held right here in this auditorium about 18 months ago, just in advance of the 2010 elections, if you can remember all the way back to that election. It's a series of papers looking at the political and demographic changes of our region, dealing with the immigration and population issues, done by both local UNLV and regional scholars. We're very proud. We had the scholars revise their papers after the election and leading up to this publication. And there's a flyer on it on your way out. You can pick one up. You'll also be hearing about it from us, maybe more than you'd like, but we're quite proud of it. So I hope you'll indulge us in that. I guess without further ado, I want to turn it over to Gary, because he has a lot of ground to cover. And I'm suspecting you may get a question or two from the audience, Gary.
Good. I'm reminded, all these lights, I once had the misfortune of having my mother see me live. She somehow found out that I was going to appear in a forum in Kansas City that went on for 2 hours, and God bless her, she watched the whole thing. And when she called me later, surprising me that she had actually seen this thing, she said, "You know, son, they do make glasses that don't glare back." And I reminded of this. These are quite bright lights. I have other relatives who often offer this kind of helpful advice too. I once, when I was a young scholar, I gave one of my first books to one of my cousins, I think, who was curious about it. And when he got back to me, he offered the following capsule review. He said, "It's the kind of book that's so exciting, once you put it down, you find you can't pick it up again." And, you know, I've learned my lesson, and I try to keep my appearances away from the attention of my relatives, and I don't give them books anymore. My talk today poses the question that leads that title page, where are the jobs? It's a relevant question here in this county and state, because I think Nevada may have the highest unemployment rate in the country at the moment. And if you wandered into this room looking for job finding tips, I can offer a straightforward answer to the question. The answer is North Dakota. In the year through last June, employment growth in that state was proportionately faster than it was anywhere else in the country. Employment grew 5.1%. And that's a darn sight better than it did in the rest of the country, where employment only grew 1%. North Dakota is also tops in the growth in the unemployment rates sweepstakes. In December, the unemployment there was just, good grief. You've got to do better, folks. The unemployment rate was just 3.3%, and that is exactly 5 percentage points less than it was the next month in the United States. Okay, so I'm guessing most of you didn't come in here to figure out what kind of migration advice I should give you. You want an economist's interpretation of the facts that gave us an unemployment rate that has remained as high as it has for as long as it has. By most measures, how about this? This works better. By most measures, the downturn in 2006 and 2007 and 2008 was the worst we've seen since the Great Depression. But it's worth reminding ourselves it wasn't the Great Depression. The Great Depression was great for two reasons. It was severe and it lasted a long time. The peak unemployment rate in the fall of 2009, when in the Great Recession it reached its peak, was 10%. But between 1933 and 1936, the peak unemployment rate was 25%, and it remained there for about 3 years. Between the summer of 1929 and the spring of 1933, the United States economy shrank for 43 successive months. At the end of the downturn, real GDP in the United States was 27% smaller than it was when the recession began in the summer of 1929. Personal consumption in the United States fell 18%. And that was from a much lower level than the level we enjoyed before the current, or the most recent recession began. The country did not get back to 1929's GDP until 1936, a span of 7 years. Okay, so the Great Recession was bad, but it wasn't that bad. In 2008 and 2009, the economy shrank for 18 months, not for 43. Real GDP fell a bit more than 5%, not 27%. And personal consumption fell a bit less than 3.5% instead of 18%. Also, GDP exceeded its pre-recession peak in 4 years, less than 4 years, not in 7 years. But still, compared to the other recessions that we've had since World War II, it was a very severe recession. The jump in unemployment was the biggest that we have seen in the post-war period. The persistence of high unemployment was longer than we've ever seen it before. The consequences of losing your job or entering the workforce and looking for a job, for the consequences of the recession for those people were worse than in any other one. The average duration of unemployment spell was about twice as long as it was in the previous worst recession, which was 1981-82. Well, the government didn't stand still. We did some stuff. And many of the actions that the government took were pretty common. They weren't unusual. There were temporary tax reductions. There were extensions in unemployment benefits. There was increased government investments in buildings and roads and technology. There were some unusual things the government did. There were health insurance subsidies for people who lost their health insurance when they lost their jobs. There were massive grants to state governments. That is very unusual in the post-war period. We haven't usually given such immense grants tied to the state of the economy to state governments. And there was an unusual level of protection for education and training programs, especially at the federal level. It's worth remembering at this point that the overwhelming share of stimulus dollars were spent on programs that would have seemed familiar to policymakers and economists in every administration since the 1960s. This is true whether the administration was a Democratic one or a Republican one. It's true whether the administration was a liberal one or a conservative one. This is also true whether Congress was in Democratic hands or Republican hands. It's absolutely true that the emphasis on different kinds of stimulus items and perhaps the overall scale of the stimulus package differed from what would have been the case if a different party or different political persuasion had been in charge. But Republican and conservative critics of the stimulus programs are kidding themselves, or they're kidding voters, when they claim to be horrified by the actual contents and the additions to the deficit that were connected with the stimulus. Republicans were in control in recessions in the mid-1970s, in the early 1980s, in 2001 to 2003, and many of the elements of the recent stimulus package were parts of the arsenal that the federal government devoted to fighting those recessions too. Notably big tax cuts, generous extensions of unemployment benefits, and some extra outlays on public infrastructure. However, the fact that most administrations after 1960 would have done many of the same things has not altered the fact that the political reaction to the policies has been negative. The average voter asks, why aren't things better already? The average politician who claims to oppose the policies says the other guy's programs made things worse, and oh, by the way, look at all they added to the deficit. And the average political supporter of the stimulus, well, what does he say? Nothing. So the only defenders left of the stimulus, as far as I can tell, are major members of the economics profession, and aside from that, there's very little in terms of defense. What is the scale of the employment challenge that we face? This chart compares the rise in unemployment after the onset of the two most severe post-war recessions, the one when President Reagan took office, 1981-82, and the most recent one that started when President Bush was in office in 2008. The blue line there is the early 1980s recession, and it traces out the rise in the unemployment rate. This is where the recession began, right there. That's month zero. That's the year, that's the month of sort of peak employment in the previous expansion, and then you see what happened after that to the unemployment rate. At first, the rise in the unemployment rate was worse in the early 80s, but the one in the 2008, 2009 had long legs, and eventually it surpassed it. And you can see that after 49 months, that brings us up to January 2012, the unemployment rate is still 3.3 percentage points higher in January than it was when the recession began at the end of 2007, whereas in the earlier recession, by about the 35th month, we were back to the pre-recession level of unemployment. And so clearly this has been much more severe in terms of how long it lasts. This chart shows the fall in payroll jobs in the economy. Once again, I have put both recessions on top of one another. This is where the recession begins. The blue, once again, is the one in the early 80s. The red is the one that began in 2008. And you can see by the 49th month after that recession began in the early 80s, the payroll employment in the United States was almost 7% higher than it was at the time of the recession, whereas this time around it's still 4% lower than it was at the start of the recession. Well, now let's compare Las Vegas to the United States as a whole. This is again the current recession. Purple is Las Vegas. Once again, the recession begins here. You can see Las Vegas has had a much more severe downturn than the United States as a whole. The United States is still got 3.3 percentage points higher unemployment rate than it did at the beginning of the recession. As I mentioned before, in Las Vegas, it's more like 7.5 percentage points higher than the unemployment rate was at the beginning of the recession. What about payroll employment? Again, you can see payroll employment looks much grimmer in Las Vegas than it does in the country as a whole. And remember, for the United States as a whole, this is the worst post-war recession. And Las Vegas is much, much worse than the United States as a whole. We're still 4 percentage points below the payroll employment we had at the beginning in where that blue line is. But Las Vegas is has got what, 13 percentage points, 14 percentage points less payroll employment now compared with the beginning of the recession. So it's grim. So what are the causes of the downturn? Why aren't there jobs? Why has the recession been so severe and the response, the recovery from it so weak? The key event that sent the economy into a tailspin was the near-death experience of the nation's major financial institutions. They made loans to many households who had weak credit records or who had the misfortune of owning and putting up for collateral on their loans assets that sank terribly in value after the housing crash occurred. These financial institutions owned or managed asset-backed securities with risks that they really didn't understand, even though they had physicists on their payrolls, even though they had fancy Wall Street traders who had who earned several million dollars a year. These guys weren't smart enough to see the risks of the assets they were putting on their company's books. When market participants began to understand the risks of these loans and the assets that backed the loans, they stopped making funds available to these shaky institutions. And that brought these institutions very close to insolvency, and it nearly brought the financial operations of the financial system of the United States to a halt. The ultimate source of this instability was the nation's housing market. This chart shows the steep rise followed by the sharp fall in real housing prices. So I'm tracing out house prices in the United States relative to all the other prices in the United States. And you can see house prices were fairly well behaved until the mid-1990s, and then they rose very sharply in value, and then they fell very sharply in value. This is Las Vegas. Las Vegas is the United States on steroids. In fact, there was no housing price appreciation relative to other prices in the US economy up through about 1999, but then prices soared and then they fell very sharply. The plunge was much steeper here than elsewhere. At the end of last year, Las Vegas house prices were 30% below their real value in 1999. I'm talking now, I'm adjusting all these prices to the general price level in the US economy, and they're lower than other prices by 30%. That means that they are more than 60% below their level, adjusting for economy-wide inflation at the 2006 peak. There was also a bubble in stock market prices, although it was much more severe in the 1990s than it was in the most recent period. But there probably were two periods of overvaluation. One was the late 1990s, and the other was the period from 2005 to 2007. Here's one peak, here's the next peak, and then stock market prices, adjusting for the price level in the US economy, fell about half between the fall of 2007 and the late winter of 2009. There's been recovery in stock market prices, unlike housing prices. This summarizes this combination of things. This is the net wealth of American households, taking account of both their stock market wealth, their bond wealth, their housing wealth, their other real estate wealth, minus all the debts that households have, divided by their in relation to their disposable personal income. And you can see, this is like the Himalayas. This is K2. That's the peak at the end of 1990s. Mostly connected to the stock market bubble in that year, but also partly to the steep rise in housing prices that had already occurred by then. And then the period up through 2006, 2007, we had the twin peaks in both the housing and the stock market. And then a steep fall in the ratio of household wealth relative to household income. Not surprisingly, this huge crash in people's wealth relative to their incomes unnerved a lot of people and made them very cautious in spending money, especially on long-lived items like houses, cars, furniture, refrigerators, but also on short-lived items like trips to Las Vegas and to Disney World. The spectacular decline in the value of houses, which badly hurt homeowners, translated into an equally spectacular fall in the value of money in the financial products that are backed by home loans. And the functioning of the nation's financial system was put at risk because all of the financial institutions that owned those mortgage-backed securities were themselves at great risk, and people were unwilling to lend those institutions any money. Now, decisive action by the Federal Reserve and by the U.S. Treasury averted this financial system collapse. I realize that this was very unpopular with the general public, but it's very hard to imagine how severe the recession would have been in the absence of those decisive actions. In the early 1930s, the government under President Hoover did not take any of those decisive actions, and we got a much, much worse calamity. But I think that very few people now alive remember the early 1930s, so no one gives governments any credit for averting what would have been an even worse catastrophe. But even these actions, these emergency actions, could not undo the steep fall in real estate prices, in stock prices, and in private bond values. Between 2007 and the beginning of 2009, the fall in the net worth of U.S. households erased $19 trillion in net household wealth, 1/4 of net worth of American households. Stock and bond prices have partly recovered, but we've still seen the erasure of $15 trillion in household wealth. And there has been essentially no rebound at all in house prices almost anywhere in the country. There are a few places where prices have edged up, but they have been more than offset by places where house prices continue to sink. If households spend about 3% of their net wealth every year, the drop in household net worth means that annual consumption by U.S. households has fallen by about $450 billion. That means at the end of last year, households would be spending 4 or 4.5% more money if we hadn't erased so much of their net worth. There's considerable evidence that, in fact, Americans spend more of the net gains they get in their houses on consumption. It's probably because of the part of the income distribution that has, for whom their house is their most important kind of wealth. But, and if people spend 5% of their housing wealth, then household consumption might be as much as $750 billion a year lower than it would be had the wealth not disappeared. So whatever estimate of this consumption effect of a lost wealth that you prefer, it's pretty clear that house price collapse and the ensuing asset price decline removed a whole lot of consumer spending power in the United States economy. It can be expected to reduce business demand for workers because businesses don't expect consumers to spend as much. That leads to layoffs. That reduces employee earnings, which has another effect on consumption because if you have less income, you also spend less. In short, the direct and indirect effects of a deflating house price bubble and the collapse in stock market prices created a huge shortfall in aggregate demand compared with what the economy could produce, and in fact was producing in 2006 and 2007. Now, a lot of stimulus actions have averted part of the collapse in consumer demand that otherwise would have occurred, but not all of it. The Fed has reduced interest rates to historically low levels. It pretty soon in the recession reduced them to zero, and they have remained at zero ever since. And in fact, they promise that they'll remain at zero for the next 18 months or 2 years. In addition, of course, we have automatic and fiscal policies to offset what goes on. Quite aside from the special programs, there's some stuff that the country automatically does every time we enter a recession. Where does the U.S. social safety net put us? Here's 21 rich countries. An organization in Paris called the OECD assembles these statistics. In 2007, it asked, well, how much money do unemployed workers receive in the first 6 months after they're laid off under the terms of the unemployment insurance system in the country? And this is the answer. The United States is indicated in red. We are the 8th lowest amongst these 21. It's not a great performance, but it's not terrible either. We're not embarrassing there. We're more embarrassing when it comes to how long does this income protection for the unemployed last. The red lines there show how many months you can collect that amount of money that I just posted in the previous slide. And in usual times, the United States is we rank 21st out of 21 rich countries. We have 6 months of benefits. It's a little bit less than the United Kingdom or Italy offers. Now, one of the things that the government did in this recession was it greatly expanded how long you can collect benefits. It added about 17 months more benefits for somebody who lives in a high unemployment state like Nevada. And so now we have a more respectable position amongst the rich industrialized countries. But bear in mind, these are only temporary. But still, that's one of the things that we've done. And one of the most important. We extended unemployment benefits. We increased monthly food stamp allotments. We gave aid to states so that they could keep on providing social assistance to children and to poor families. We doubled the budget for training unemployed and hard-to-employ workers. We increased the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. We invented a make work pay credit. All these things cut people's taxes. We also gave a lot of aid to people who weren't particularly badly hurt by the recession, at least in terms of their income. Federal income tax cuts, payroll tax cuts. My family has 2 earners. We get both of these. Actually, our wages haven't declined in the recession, so we're getting a tax reduction, and we're part of the not so afflicted. There are special grants to Social Security recipients, veterans pension recipients if they don't pay any income taxes. Again, these people didn't get directly hurt by the recession because as veterans, pensioners, and Social Security recipients, they're retired. They didn't lose their jobs. Okay, so what are some of the effects of these? As a result of the automatic stabilizers, you know, the regular unemployment insurance system and food stamps and so forth, and the special additional tax cuts and stimulus provided, the government did succeed in boosting families' after-tax incomes. Now, the red line in this chart, the red line, shows what people's pre-tax non-government incomes, what happened to their government incomes. What I've done is I've marked as 100 the total incomes that people received under these measures at the end of 2007, at the end of the last economic expansion. And then I trace over the next, until the end of 2011, what have their incomes been? What have Americans' incomes been using these two different income measures. And one income measure is the gross market income. This is the pre-tax income from wages, from salaries, from net self-employment earnings, from interest and dividends, rent payments that you receive from your tenants. And you can see that at the worst point, at the end of 2009, income from private income sources dropped 10% compared with what it was before the recession began. Well, that's a pretty big drop. Now, the blue lines show what happened to your disposable incomes over the same period. And you'll notice that the biggest drop was about 3%. So instead of seeing your incomes fall as much as the market was causing them to fall, government programs like tax cuts, unemployment benefits, and so on, held up people's disposable income so they didn't fall nearly so severely. This chart focuses directly on what happened to government transfer payments. Once again, the red line in there indicates the market incomes, what you're getting from your private income sources. But those green bars show what the government is paying in transfer payments. The government is not giving you more income than you got from market income. I'm measuring both relative to how high they were at the end of the last economic expansion. And you can see that unlike market incomes, at the peak, it looks like at the end of 2010, people's government benefits, Social Security benefits, unemployment benefits, food stamp benefits, whatever, government benefits were 25% higher per person in the country compared with where they were before the recession began. So the government did a lot to try to reduce the pain being inflicted by the recession. So this one focuses on the dollar amounts. Once again, the beginning of the line there is that last month of economic expansion before the recession, and then I trace out in the red line there how much Americans' tax payments to the government fell. And you can see at the low point there, at the end of 2009, Americans' tax payments per person were more than $1,600 less than they had been. And a lot of that were special tax reductions made either at the end of the Bush administration or at the beginning of the Obama administration. The blue line shows the additional government benefits compared to the benefits that were received at the end of the last economic expansion. And even today, those are still about $1,070 per person higher than they were before the recession began. Now, I'm not very good at arithmetic, but my math says that this means that every man, woman, and child in the United States is getting a combined total of $2,150 a year more at the end of last year in government as tax cuts, as payroll tax reductions, as additional transfer benefits, compared with the amount that they were getting at the end of the last economic expansion. Some of this is automatic. You pay lower taxes when your incomes fall. You get unemployment benefits when you get laid off. But a lot of it is due to the stimulus programs. Okay, so this is... But in spite of all of these transfers that we've made, in spite of the interest rate policy of the Federal Reserve, the huge loss in household wealth still means that a lot of consumer buying power has been removed from the economy. We are emerging from the slump slowly, too slowly. The gap between what the economy does produce and what it could produce if we were operating at full employment is about $1 trillion a year in national income, or roughly 6% of the amount that we're producing right now. There's a straightforward explanation for why we have 8.3% unemployment and why the employment to population ratio in the United States is 5 percentage points lower than it was when the recession began. And that simple explanation is the financial crisis, the housing bust, severely damaged the creditworthiness of tens of millions of borrowers. It reduced the willingness of financial institutions in this country to lend to anybody but those who have very perfect credit records. And household saving rate has climbed, indicating people's unwillingness to spend. Back in 2008 and 2009, businesses saw sizable drops in consumer demands. Many businesses anticipated that the future was going to look very grim because they could already they could see that households were soon going to understand, and the lending institutions were soon going to understand what the implications of this lost asset values were going to be on household spending ability. New home construction plunged. When there's a surplus of unoccupied houses on the market and there's a growing number of houses put on the market because of foreclosures, home builders see very little prospect that they're going to make money by starting another development. Between 2006 and 2011, employment in the construction industry fell in the United States by 2.2 million workers. Almost all of them were men. That's why it was called a man session. But that's a 28% drop in construction employment in the United States. There has been no recovery. Those jobs are gone. There has been no recovery. Now here's the trend in Las Vegas. Between 1980 and 2011, you can see, if you look carefully, evidence of earlier recessions, because Las Vegas had earlier recessions. The one in the early 1980s, there's one in the early 1990s, there's one around 2000, 2001, and so the construction industry did indeed lag during those periods. But there's nothing like this period from 2006 up to the present. I mean, that is an immense drop, and it's hard to believe that those construction jobs are going to come back anytime soon unless Las Vegas begins to grow a lot faster than it's been growing. The absence of rebound in home building depresses the purchases of all kinds of consumer durable products that are linked to buying a new home. Households' depressed appetite or capacity for spending is also evident in their purchase of new cars and trucks. This slide shows how many motor vehicles are assembled in the United States. Here, my baseline is just the average amount that were assembled between 1994 and 2007. It was relatively stable. There were small recessions, but it was pretty stable that period. And so I'm just showing for each month after January 2008, well, how high is production, assembly of these vehicles in the United States compared with the average between 1994 and 2007. And you can see, you know, the worst was when President Obama took office. It's when Chrysler and General Motors were about to fail and would have failed without massive loans from the United States government. There's been a recovery, but even so, assembly of motor vehicles in the United States is still more than a fifth lower than it was on average. We think it's great. People say it's a healthy auto market, but the fact of the matter is it's way down compared with what it was on average before 2008. The explanation for our current fix for the lack of jobs is that there's too little aggregate demand in the United States. Using conventional policy tools, there may be very little that the Federal Reserve can do to lower interest rates any further. It can cut short-term interest rates on longer-term bonds and borrowing a little bit, but it can't do much over the policy tool over which it exercises the greatest control, which is short-term interest rates on federal debt. Those interest rates are essentially zero. The usual policy remedy, when you've exhausted all that monetary policy can do, is to rely on fiscal policy. Now, some of you may be saying, we already tried that and it failed. There's no evidence that fiscal policy failed. Zero. 6 months after the onset of the big stimulus that was passed in February 2009, the economy stopped shrinking and it started growing again. Within a few months, private sector employment started to rebound, and it's grown ever since without any interruption. About a fifth of this private sector job creation is being offset by public sector job losses. States, localities are dismissing lots of workers. But even though the total public plus private employment is growing, it's growing too slowly. I estimate that we need about 10 million jobs, possibly 10.5 million jobs to reach full employment today. At last year's pace, we added about 1.6, 1.7 million jobs last year. At last year's pace, we would need about 6.5 years to generate 10 million extra jobs. And in those 6.5 years, there's going to be growth in the working age population, so we're going to have to generate more than that. So what is tragic is that much of this excess unemployment is unnecessary. There are a lot of useful things that 2 or 3 million unemployed workers could do if they were put on public or private payrolls to improve the country we live in. There are millions of savers who are eager to hold safe assets, and for most of the world that still means United States government debt. In other words, these people are willing to lend funds to our government at historically low interest rates, and if households and businesses are unwilling to spend their cash reserves on consumption or investment and are eager to lend money to the federal government, I think the federal government can certainly identify, organize, and complete many useful projects with the money that households are willing to lend it. So the first thing we could do to boost aggregate demand to reduce some of this shortfall, 10 million person shortfall in employment, is to build or improve the nation's infrastructure. We can also offer direct incentives to private businesses to add to their payrolls this year or next. For example, we could exempt employers from making payroll tax contributions on their net additions to their payrolls for the next couple of years. This makes it cheaper for companies to expand their businesses this year and next compared with waiting until 3 or 4 years in the future to expand their businesses. Let me be clear. All of the stimulus items we spent money on, all of them, especially the tax cuts, the special benefit payments to Social Security recipients, the unemployment benefits, were stuff we've done before in past recessions. We've done a lot more of it this time because the recession is much worse and it was much more persistent. These are things we've done before, even when conservatives run the White House, run the Congress, or run both. And this is where most of the stimulus money went. It did not go to building bridges to nowhere. I'll show you some statistics in a minute. But the point is that stimulus spending that we spent money on was devoted to items that conservatives have often found tasty in the past when they run the government. Now, some learned economists and not so learned politicians will look you in the eye with a straight face tell you that the stimulus has been a failure, that the government issued a huge amount of extra debt without producing a beneficial effect on the economy. But can this really be true? Remember this picture I showed you before. The red line shows you what the private economy was generating in income for people in the United States. It fell by 10%. Houses weren't being built, cars weren't being built, people weren't coming to Las Vegas, they weren't going to Disney World, people weren't buying as much food in restaurants. The private economy was producing 10% less income. And look at what the stimulus measures meant. They meant that the disposable incomes of Americans only fell 3% because people received extra benefits, they paid lower taxes. Does anyone in this room seriously think that had no effect on households' willingness to spend? on businesses' willingness to put people on their payrolls to meet the demand for American consumers? This is an absurd argument. And I was, even though this has come up a lot, there are some economists that have become well known for saying the stimulus program has been a terrible failure. They did a poll of economists recently. Actually, a conservative university, the University of Chicago, did the poll. They asked a bunch of economists. 80% of them said, yes, it worked. So even the supposed disagreement among economists turns out to be manufactured. The overwhelming consensus in the economics profession is, yes, the stimulus worked. This difference between what happened to people's disposable incomes and what would have happened to their market incomes made a difference in how much people consume. It didn't make as big a difference as we would want because people's wealth was also lower. People lost a huge amount of money in the financial market collapse. There's no getting around that fact, but given how much they lost and given how much people's private incomes fell, consumption held up remarkably well. In the Great Depression, consumption fell 18%. In this recession, it fell 3.5%. Now, I think there's a major difference there. A CNN poll in January 2010 showed that about 3/4 of Americans thought that half or more of the stimulus spending was, quote, wasted. 45% of the respondents to that poll thought that most or nearly all the stimulus dollars had been wasted. Now, if you understand how the stimulus money was spent, this must seem like a very odd view. Most of the stimulus money was spent directly on them, on the people responding to the poll. The biggest slice went as tax cuts to them. Other big slices went to unemployment insurance benefit payments, to Social Security recipients, to veterans, VA pensioners. That means that if the stimulus dollars were wasted, you know who wasted them? The people who were responding to the poll, because they're the ones who got the money. Okay, so what did the stimulus look like? Here I've just tried to make it as simple as possible. Simple primary colors. When most people, especially politicians and reporters, talk about the stimulus, they are referring specifically to the program authorized by Congress and President Obama in February 2009 as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which I'll call ARRA because it's shorter. So how were those funds allocated? Well, the bottom chunk, the blue chunk there's two different periods, 2009 and 2010. That money's already been spent. 2011 to 2019, that's going to be spent over future years. The blue line at the bottom is the infrastructure spending. It's the roads, the highways, it's the research and development investment. UNLV is probably getting some of that. And you can see the initial phase, it's not very much. It's a very small slice. The red stuff above it is the direct income assistance, the unemployment benefits, and the tax cuts. And the yellow line at the top, that yellow chunk at the top, is the aid that the federal government gave to state and local governments. Most of the infrastructure money, as you can see, is not supposed to be spent until sometime in the future because a lot of these programs are just getting going to fix the roads or build new buildings. Up to this very moment, such spending, the spending on infrastructure and bridges and roads, has been a very small part of the overall stimulus package. The overwhelming share of stimulus funds were spent on temporary tax cuts, benefit improvements, and this really understates the amount that has been devoted to the benefit increases and tax cuts. Why? Because this only refers to that one stimulus package. There was also a stimulus package under President Bush before he left office, that exclusively consisted of tax cuts and unemployment insurance benefits. And since the February 2009 period, all of the stimulus has been in the form of higher unemployment benefits and lower taxes. So actually this understates the amount that's been devoted to those items. Now we come to one large and unusual feature of the 2009 stimulus package, namely all that earmarked aid for state and local governments. You can see that the money given in aid to the states is twice as big in the initial phase of the stimulus as the amount that's spent on, you know, roads, bridges, and so forth and so on. And when Congress authorized all that money, it was worried that the sharp fall off in state and local revenues connected with the recession would push local lawmakers to cut benefits to the unemployed, to trim educational spending in their states, to fire a lot of public workers. Well, the stimulus ran out, and that is exactly what those local folks did. The special fiscal relief from the federal government was large enough to offset about a third of the expected loss in their revenues that occurred because of the recession. Now, how did states and localities actually spend the money? I think it's going to take years of careful research to find out, but let me tell you this. One thing is certainly clear, state and local public employment held up very well, and in fact it actually increased modestly in the first 14 or 15 months of the recession. And it began to fall in 2010 when that part of the stimulus came to an end, or when there was no more federal special relief for state and local governments. Fortunately for the country, at the same time that state and local public employee went down, private employment started to recover. So there has been an improvement in overall employment in spite of the fact that state and local government employment fell. Oh, by the way, interesting fact, during the Reagan period, state and local employment continued to rise. So one of the most ironical claims against the stimulus is how it's expanded the government. Actually, the government is smaller than it was in terms of employees before the recession began. But this aid to the states, how was it spent? If the polling respondents are correct that the money was wasted, then a lot of the money was wasted by state and local lawmakers, not by Congress, because they gave the money to state and local lawmakers to spend it. And I suspect that one of the ways that state and local lawmakers spent the money was avoiding tax increases that otherwise they would have been forced to make early in the recession. So once again, the money went to taxpayers in the form of lower tax payments than they otherwise would have spent, or at least part of it was. So again, this means that the wasting was being done by someone besides the Congress, unless you think giving aid and tax cuts is a waste of resources. Okay. Well, this color slide just shows you the timing of that first stimulus package, how the money is spent in different years. And you can see how the stimulus spending in the form of infrastructure is going to last a long time, but there isn't a lot of money there. That's the sad thing about that picture. So, summarizing what was actually done to stimulate the economy, to keep more jobs from disappearing. Well, what was actually done? Mostly what the government did consisted of old and well-tried fiscal strategies we've seen in earlier recessions, just more of it. But that makes sense. It was a bigger recession. Of course, there was automatic stabilization. The programs that automatically click in when our incomes fall and people get laid off, they clicked in, as they usually do. And then there was a grab bag of special fiscal measures, tax cuts, unemployment benefit extensions, government capital projects. The stimulus package passed when Obama took office contained a couple of new elements. There was the massive federal aid to state and local governments. As I said, that was uncommon. We don't usually do that in this country. And there was an unusual focus on protecting government and household spending on education and training, at least at the federal level. We know that at the state and local level, there have been major cutbacks in university education. It's a peculiar time to do this because, of course, enrollments in colleges and community colleges rise when people between the ages of 18 and 24 have a tough time in the labor market. They tend to enroll in school to improve their credentials, and it seems like an ironical time to be trimming the size of community college and university budgets, but that is what a lot of states are doing. So what did Congress avoid doing? Ironically, given a lot of the criticisms of its policies, it spent relatively little on investment in public works or in direct hiring of public workers. This kind of spending was considered too slow or too politically dangerous, perhaps too fraught with political and administrative issues, so Congress avoided doing it. We know that President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, wouldn't have avoided that, but this Congress did. For most ordinary Americans and for many reporters and for an embarrassingly large number of economists who write op-ed pieces, this kind of infrastructure investment seems to be what they think the stimulus consisted of. Higher public infrastructure investment, more public employment. That's just not true. And a big irony is the country would actually have been better off if the stimulus did contain a whole lot more money for direct spending items. One number that is just mind-boggling when you read the gross national product statistics of the United States is the combined amount that the federal government, state and local governments spend on capital investment is smaller now than it was in 2007. What kind of country do we live in where with all these unemployed construction workers, all these unemployed manufacturing workers, we're actually spending less even though it's easy to raise funds for those projects right now? The world is eager to lend money to the federal government, and yet we're spending less at all levels of government. The only level of government that's spending more than we did before the recession is the federal government. And its increase is offset by the declines in what localities and states are spending. Well, the reason I say this is ironical is that this kind of spending, unlike the tax cut that has gone very generously to myself and my wife, is money that is likely to be, well, it by definition is spent right away. It puts people to work right away. You give the money to me as a tax cut, maybe I'm going to salt it away in my bank account. Maybe I'm going to pay down a credit card bill. That's not going to put money in somebody else's pocket who's producing something that I'm buying. Spending the money more directly would have been more helpful. So let's return to my opening question. Where are the jobs? Consumers lost gobs of wealth. Their houses are worth less than they were 5 years ago. Their capacity to spend, their capacity to borrow has been badly hurt. Short-term interest rates are as low as they can go. You can't drop them below zero because then people will just take their money out of banks and keep it as cash, which does have a 0% interest rate the last time I checked. Short-term, okay, so if consumers aren't in a position to buy much, in spite of the fact that they have lower taxes and receive higher government benefits, employers do not have an appetite to add very quickly to their payrolls, nor do they have an appetite to add very much to their investment in their plant and the size of their business, at least with regard to producing stuff here in the United States. The usual remedy when there is inadequate aggregate demand, taught to us since the 1930s, and a lesson vividly learned in the 1940s, when the Great Depression ended as if by magic within 12 months of Pearl Harbor, is expansionary fiscal policy. We tried that policy and it worked. Unfortunately, too many voters and policymakers think it didn't work. We ought to have tried the policy, but in bigger doses, and we should have adopted programs where a very high fraction of the additions to the national debt were translated into higher immediate spending that puts someone to work. by businesses, by state and local governments, by the federal government. And it's too bad that we didn't. Now, questions? Yeah.
To what extent has there been any consideration of a WPA type of employment scheme? If not, why not? And what would it take to move such a thing? I should say, apart from the politics of the situation, but I'm not going to say that.
I think it was in the early fall of 2009. I already knew that the economy was recovering, although it seemed to have been a secret to a lot of people. And already, I think the stimulus was considered a failure. And the director of the Office of Management and Budget came to Brookings, and I asked him the question, that very question. I said, you know, it seems to me that there's a major risk that not only, we're going to have the worst of two recessions. We're going to have the recession of the early 1980s with a very high jump in the unemployment rate. In the early 80s, the unemployment rate actually hit 10.8%. So it was higher than it was the highest at the worst point in this recession. And we're going to have the recoveries that we saw in the early 1990s and after the 2001 recession. And those were very, very slow recoveries in the job market. I said, is the administration thinking about what you can do about this high unemployment rate that could last for a very, very long time, which of course it subsequently has done? And the answer was nothing. Nothing. They hadn't thought because maybe they were hopeful that the recovery would be like the recovery that we saw in the early 1980s, because it was a very strong recovery. I wasn't very confident at the time that that was going to be the case. And alternatively, they thought trying to ask Congress for something like that now would be very difficult because people had already concluded the stimulus that had been tried so far was a failure. And they didn't think there was any payoff in asking Congress for something that Congress would not be willing to grant. But personally, I think we can let private businesses do the construction, do the projects. It's just that they need someone to pay the bills, and I think the government could pay the bills. That's my opinion. Was there another question? Yeah.
I'm going to try and pull a couple of thoughts together that seem to tie into me. You talked about the $2,150 per person from net transfer. And looking at that chart, thank you. One of the things that's interesting to me is if you overlaid that with the chart you had before about families' expendable income, the market income, I think what you're addressing are two different demographics, by the way, in that market income might be from people from investments that would traditionally, the baby boomers, and there's been a fair amount of economic analysis of what's happening to the return on investments for those that are at the retirement age, which happen to be a large percentage of population still. So as the market income has gone down, the disposable income has gone up. There's a change in who is benefiting from these low interest rates.
I think that the stimulus package has been pretty broadly based. Certainly the people who have suffered proportionately the most in the loss of market income are the people who lost their jobs.
More than the savers? I think there are certain economists that would at least argue that those who had invested and saved and have lost a percentage of their home in the market, but still have equity in it because they didn't have the highly leveraged loans. So I would look at that as your market income person.
I'll make a distinction between wealth Okay, so here are two kinds of wealth. One is house prices. Well, actually, this doesn't show the net worth but it does show something that's going to be related to your net worth. How much is your house worth? Okay, so this is wealth. This is wealth. This is stock market. This is the wealth to income ratio, but and this is just income, pure and simple. You're absolutely right. Investors took a very huge hit. I mean, that's the whole point. When I said a quarter of American net worth was wiped out between the fall of 2007 and March of 2009. A quarter disappeared. That's a huge loss. I completely agree with you. But this is showing income flows, and your capital losses don't show up here. This is just your flow of wages. And I think that in terms of income, the biggest losers are the people who go from having a job, a middle-class job, a high-class job, to having nothing, okay? And the blue line is showing an income item that partly replaces that, because included in disposable income are the unemployment benefits those people receive. If they pay lower taxes, and they have paid lower taxes, there's less of a subtraction from their market income to pay those taxes. And it's a combination of lower taxes and higher government direct benefits that has so insulated Americans from the losses that the market was trying to impose on them. I completely agree with you about the savers, because that's half of my story. Half of my story is there is a massive amount of wealth erased by the crash of the house price bubble and the crash of stock market prices. That's exactly right. But here, when we're just talking about a flow of income, unemployment benefits show up in the blue bars, your wages show up in the red bar, your interest payments. Yes, interest payments have certainly fallen, you're right, I agree. Proportionally they've fallen, but for how many people in the United States are interest payments even you know, a quarter of their income? It's not very many.
But a greater percentage as the baby boomers, that big part, hits retirement. So I think that's something. And I would question when you say that the world is eager to lend to the U.S. The most recent statistics have shown that China has reduced by something like 18% their holdings in U.S. currencies.
Well, all that matters
in the
is,
past
in fact,
year,
it would be better for the United States if its own citizens were the ones eager to lend.
Instead of the Fed?
Yes, instead of...
Yeah, the Fed is buying itself.
So the low interest rates do not attract, I think you called it personal income, household income, willing to hold U.S. debt. I think the answer is that's not true. That's why if you look at what's getting invested in, dollars going offshore again, looking at where are the investment opportunities. So low interest rates, below expected inflation rates, become a problem.
Well, I agree with you that the Federal Reserve controls the short-term interest rate. The Federal Reserve has no control over the 30-year bond rate. And the 30-year bond rate is a little over 3%.
But as long
as they continue to buy and be the buyer and make the balance sheet blow up by simply buying the 30-year themselves and holding it, the U.S. government. I mean, it's bookkeeping is all that's going on as to who owns the 30-year and why is the interest rate able to be as low as it is.
I think that that's wrong. I think that the United States is selling plenty of debt to plenty of institutions and private people around the world that want to hold the debt.
Well, I think that's why we've gone to 10-year.
Not 30-year. I don't think we have 30-year debt anymore, right? Nobody's taking it.
I think that they released it again. Yes.
No, I just want to point out that as long as our trade deficit remains, we're borrowing from the rest of the world, whether from China or from anybody else. So the arithmetic, really confirms what you're saying and not what he's suggesting, that people in the rest of the world aren't willing to find a safe haven in the United States. They continue to pour their their savings into U.S. assets.
Right.
It's inevitable.
The rest of the world is still buying American assets. Some combination of corporate debt, corporate stocks, real estate in the United States. They're buying something from us because otherwise we wouldn't have the trade deficit that we have. Yes?
What about the negative outflows from money market funds, stock funds, and bond funds with respect to domestic investors? It appeared, I mean, personally, I've taken all my money out of the market. I have no faith. I think there's millions that feel the same way I do.
I don't quite hear you.
The point this gentleman made was the trade imbalance. There is no trade imbalance because the investment makes up the trade imbalance.
Well, there's a trade in goods in which the United States has a very big deficit, and the way we pay the people who are sending us all these goods for which we're not giving them goods in exchange is we're sending little pieces of paper that say United States government bond, or they say General Motors stock certificate, or they say Apple.
Perhaps the problem, though, is the propensity of Americans to buy our own debt or to buy our own equity is permanently changed after a loss of 25% of our wealth. I would vote yes. I lost more than 25%, and I'm not investing in anything domestic. I see no reason.
How do you hold your savings?
Gold. I've made about 45%.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, but it's a hedge, it's not an investment. It's not a true investment. True investments, though, the third world is growing. A lot of international companies show their growth in other markets, not the developed markets in the U.S. and Europe. I would argue that you're right on in your conclusion, but that the propensity of Americans to invest in American equities and debt has permanently changed.
Well, for my sins, I also have done a lot of work on retirement, and one of the big mysteries about how people save for retirement is why Americans, but not just Americans, people around the world, are so biased in favor of holding assets from their home country. There has been a trend in the United States for people holding more overseas assets and, as you say, substituting. But I think that most, if you're a finance guru, and I'm not a finance guru, but I dabble in the literature a little bit enough to read what people say, the mystery is why Americans held so little of their assets in terms of, English stock and Japanese bonds and Chinese stock certificates and so forth. According to economic theory, we should hold more. And so the country is just moving gradually along a path to owning more. I don't think actually this has much to do with why we have high unemployment at the moment. There's one other question.
Yeah, I would agree with you that the stimulus package greatly reduced the severity of the recession, but what about the long-term effects of that, including moral hazard and maybe individual reliance on the government? And look at the unemployment benefits. Wouldn't that affect maybe worker productivity in the long run?
Well, certainly offering more generous and longer lasting unemployment benefits is a two-edged sword. I'm sure some of the people that collected almost 2 years of unemployment benefits probably did look less seriously for work. And I'm sure it added to the duration of their unemployment. Strangely enough, however, that has no implications about whether it raised overall unemployment in the United States at all. And the reason is very simple. In the worst part of the recession, there was about 5 job seekers for every job opening. And even today, I think it's like 4 to 1. That means that if you have an unemployed worker who's collecting unemployment benefits that discourages that worker from looking as intensively for jobs and accepting jobs that maybe their unemployment benefits permit them to decline, there's still 4 other people in the queue behind them, half of whom are not collecting any unemployment benefits. Because remember, a lot of the rise in the unemployment in the United States has not been because people are being laid off in great numbers. In fact, the layoff rate in the United States, I think by the end of 2010, was pretty much the same as it was in 2007. It's all of these people that are just entering the workforce because, you know, they're 18 years old, they're 20 years old, they're 22, they're 24, they're finishing up their schooling, they're looking to get their career going, and there's no jobs for them. Those people do not qualify for unemployment benefits, and I think a lot of them would take unemployment benefits as soon as they can. The other thing to bear in mind about the social safety net in the United States is, since 1958, in every recession, the Congress has enacted special extensions of unemployment insurance benefits. It's true, we've never offered people 99 weeks before this recession. The longest we ever offered before this was about 65 weeks in the mid-1970s. But having said that, if you don't realize that this is a tight-fisted country and we're not going to leave unemployment benefits at 99 weeks, you know, when the economy gets a little better, you haven't been paying attention, because whenever the unemployment rate goes down again, we go back to offering just 6 months of benefits, which, as my diagram showed, is as little as is offered in any rich industrialized country. So I'm not terribly worried about that. If you are referring instead to the moral hazard of large financial institutions, who always think they're going to be bailed out, I think there the evidence is a little mixed. Some of these financial institutions did go under, and I'm sure if you held a vote of most leaders of the world, did the United States do the right thing when it let Lehman Brothers go bankrupt? Most people would say, you did the wrong thing. You should have kept them going too. But there's a big company. It was up until that time, that was the biggest bankruptcy in the history of the world, I think. We let them go under, and within 2 or 3 days, the world was mired in the worst financial crisis since the early 1930s. So moral hazard, yes, that's a bad thing, but so is having a disaster like we had after Lehman Brothers went under.
There's a great note on which to close the evening. I just want to thank you all for coming. Gary will be around. We can continue this discussion, but I wanted to, for those of you who felt a need to leave, we've run over, and I don't want you to feel obligated, but there'll be time for more questions.